Welcome back to Face the Nation. I'm Margaret Brennan. We continue our conversation with Obama administration Homeland Security Secretary Jeh Johnson. Jay, let's pick up where we were talking about this House Intelligence Committee report into alleged collusion and Russian meddling in 2016. In the report, which you've acknowledged, you wish it weren't just a Republican paper because it is so serious. But the conclusion is that the intelligence community should immediately inform presidential candidates when they discover a legitimate counterintelligence threat to the campaign and notify Congress. And they fault the administration for not doing that when you were in office.
Well, I think that's a legitimate recommendation. Anytime a campaign is the target of a hack, a cyber hack, the campaign itself should be aware of that, so take proper action.
Why weren't they? Why wasn't the Trump campaign?
Well, I believe that it's the case that at various points along the way, the right people were informed. Certainly the DNC was informed of what we saw and what we were seeing at the time. The FBI and eventually DHS was working with the DNC. But I agree that there should be a more methodical way of doing this. And this was not the first time, by the way, in 2016, that a campaign had been infiltrated in some way by a cyber attack. And typically, law enforcement and DHS will work with the campaign to make sure they take corrective action. You'd have to ask the FBI about the relationship with the interaction with the Trump campaign. But I don't argue with the recommendation.
You've testified publicly that when the administration did decide to make public the evidence they had of Russian interference attempts, October 2016, 1 month before the election.
October 7, 2016.
That
yes.
You fault the media for not paying enough attention to it because
Correct.
of the Access Hollywood report coming out at the same time. But doesn't the administration bear some responsibility for not detailing it more, doing more background, and sharing more information with reporters?
Well, actually, the House Intel report, I think, does a decent job of laying out all the different considerations that went into that attribution. And we had to declassify a lot of very sensitive intelligence to get to that. And anytime you do that, you have to be concerned about compromising sources and means. And so we said as much as we could say at the time without seriously jeopardizing our sources and means. And the statement itself was pretty blunt and pretty straightforward by saying that at the highest levels of the Russian government, there was an attempt to interfere with the ongoing political campaign. A number of us thought it was very, very important that we tell the American voters what was going on at the time before the election. And then after the election, we came back in much greater detail to tell the American public exactly what happened.
But you wish that alarm bell had been a little louder?
I wish that the alarm bell had been heard by more people. As you point out, the Access Hollywood video was released the same day, and the speculation over the next several days was whether or not candidate Trump was going to drop out, and our statement was literally below the fold news that day.
I want to ask you as well about James Comey, your former colleague, former FBI director, his new book. He writes about you in it. And a phone call you made to him telling him to be, quote, very careful when he briefed President-elect Trump about this so-called Steele dossier.
Right.
What were you thinking? Why were you telling him to be careful?
Well, first, Jim has been a friend for almost 30 years, from the days we were federal prosecutors together. And it's actually the case in Washington that when you're in a very senior position like FBI director or Secretary of Homeland Security, it's a lonely place. And very few people north of you or south of you or sitting right next to you are going to take the time to warn you if they think that you're about to do something that is treacherous, perhaps a mistake.
Did you think it was a mistake?
I was very concerned when I heard the plan for the director of the FBI to one-on-one brief Mr. Trump about this dossier. Jim and I had discussed over time the Hoover era history of the FBI. My own grandfather, and Jim knows this, who was a sociologist, has an FBI file of several hundred pages. So Jim and I talked about the history of the FBI, and he literally finished my sentence when I said, there's a fine distinction, Jim, between telling somebody, just so you know, and telling somebody, just so you know, and don't mess with us. And I was concerned that the president-elect was going to hear the latter and not the former message. And Jim understood that, and I think he did his best.
Would you have done the same thing if you were in Comey's position?
That's a good question. I was not in the FBI director's position, but I was concerned about what he was about to do, and felt as a friend that I should talk to him, because I had met Mr. Trump during the campaign and during the transition.
And you advised otherwise. All right. Well, Jay, thank you very much for coming on.
Pleasure to be on.
Responding. We'll be right back with our political panel, so don't go away. It's time now for some political analysis, and we're joined today by David Nakamura. He covers the White House for the Washington Post. Susan Page is the Washington bureau chief at USA Today. Jamelle Bouie is the chief political correspondent at Slate and a CBS News political analyst. And Jonah Goldberg is a senior editor at the National Review and the author of Suicide of the West: How the Rebirth of Nationalism, Populism, and Identity Politics is Destroying American Democracy. So, David, how late were you at the White House Correspondents' Dinner last night?
I made it through the whole thing, Margaret.
You did?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes, it was quite a moment. Look, I've been in a number of these, and Michelle Wolf's not the first comedian to make some of the forward type of jokes that were made yesterday. But it was awkward. I was at a table at the Washington Post table with Congressman Mark Meadows, big Trump supporter, very, very hard conservative, and he and his wife were not really reacting, trying to keep a straight face when these things were happening, and so it was, the murmur in the room was notable for the reaction even journalists had to some of the things that were being said.
Because of how harsh some of the jokes
harsh?
were.
I think the focus for journalists, including myself, is that this is supposed to be a celebration, certainly of the work that's done, their student scholarships. It's something that we're talking about the First Amendment, and that's what is to be celebrated. Sometimes I think these things can go over and sort of overshadow that.
Susan, you used to head the White House Correspondents Association. When the Trump campaign held this rally, which was kind of counter-programming out in Michigan, the announcement said that the Correspondents' Dinner is for the fake news media to toast themselves. And the president said, "Why would I want to be stuck in a room with a bunch of fake news liberals who hate me?" Did last night buttress that narrative? Did it change it at all?
I think anytime you can have a split screen and you have the president attacking the press, and next to it you can have a journalist dinner with a comedian attacking the president in the very critical way the comedian did last night, that is reinforcing a narrative that is not helpful to us. And the White House Correspondents Association does a lot of good work for the journalists who are on the beat every day in terms of access and other issues. But we've had awkward dinners before, no question. But this is a different time. This is a time when this week a poll came out done by Quinnipiac that showed a majority of Republicans say the press is an enemy of the American people, not a defender of democracy. And that is an impression that we need to do everything we can to show that that is not true and that is not the case, and that we're motivated not by partisanship but by a search for the truth.
Jonah, you talk broadly about identity politics and populism and nationalism in your book. Where does this piece of it fit in, this narrative about the media?
Yeah, I think, look, I'm not a huge fan of the Correspondents' Dinner. I've been to a bunch of them. I think one of the problems is that it feeds into a narrative, since that's the word of the morning, that is really useful to populists. To say, hey, look, once it started becoming sort of like an East Coast version of the Oscars, with the red carpets and who are you wearing and all that kind of stuff, I think the Washington Press Corps kind of lost track of itself. And I'm someone who has dinged President Trump often for his narcissism. The institutional narcissism that was on display last night from the Correspondents' Dinner, I think, was a gift to President Trump. The crudeness towards Sarah Huckabee Sanders was a gift to the White House. It lets them double down on these elites are persecuting us storyline. And I think it was a really bad note for the Washington Press Corps.
Jamelle, some of the pushback from comedians and others has been, well, the president has made personal attacks on people in the past, and there hasn't been the same sort of horror by people in the administration that was expressed last night. Is that a fair defense, or is this sort of bringing everyone down in terms of what the benchmark for behavior should be?
I think you could say it's a little bit of both. I think it is fair to note that the president has vulgar. I mean, it is vulgar. It has insulted private citizens, has attacked private citizens. The president famously could not bring himself, or infamously could not bring himself, to condemn white supremacist protesters, which I consider to be vulgar. So given that, it's sort of funny to see defenders of the administration say, well, hold on, these jokes are too much, given who they either work for or who they are defending. I do want to make a larger point about sort of the press and its relationship to the American public and sort of the disdain for the press, which is, I hope we can avoid some presentism here, that the press's problem of legitimacy with the public goes back decades. This is a long-term problem. It is a function both of mistakes made by the press corps and of an active campaign of delegitimization against the press. And so to think that something like this dinner encapsulates or represents the problem, I don't think it's quite true. I agree with Jonah's criticisms of sort of the spectacle of it all, but this problem of press legitimacy goes back a long time, and I think we should be careful not to think of it solely in terms of events like this.
David, the president's nominee to run the VA, Ronnie Jackson, his personal physician, withdrew this week amid a number of very detailed allegations about his behavior, drunkenness, etc. The president last night at his rally had this to say. I want to play this soundbite about the senator making some of these allegations. The soundbite's not there. Let me read it to you. John Tester of Montana started throwing out things that he's heard. Well, I know things about Tester that I could say too. And if I said them, he would never be elected again.
He's trying to make this an issue, the way that Tester handled this. But I think the bigger issue here goes back again to Dr. Ronnie Jackson. The amount of unsourced allegations that were sort of put out there, I think, was is now being found to, not all of these things are being found to have been true about what was said about Ronnie Jackson. We don't know the extent of what was true, what wasn't true. But I think Trump's trying to make this an issue for Tester and make it a partisan issue. Even though I think the bigger question was, how much vetting did the White House do about this candidate? And what were his real credentials on management? Beyond sort of even the personal conduct, because this is a doctor who did get high marks from President Obama and his administration, a bipartisan administration, but he doesn't have any management experience. And this is a really troubled agency. And for Trump, it's an important domestic priority. So if he can sort of make this a sort of a gotcha about Democrats sort of trying to undermine him, I think that's what he's going for.
Susan, should we expect the president to be campaigning out in Montana? Does this now change the race?
I'm sure Republicans hope he is, because that's a state that went for him in a big way. But 6 months from next Tuesday is the midterm election. And I think that there are those in the White House who are concerned that the president is not aware of in what peril he stands if the House is controlled by the Democrats after the November midterms, or even the Senate, how his life is going to change in terms of investigations and subpoenas, much less passage of legislation. And I think there is an effort by those close to the president to give him a wake-up call about campaigning in Montana, about adjusting some of his behavior and some of his rhetoric to help endangered Republican candidates in a lot of races where you might not expect Republicans to be in trouble.
Speaking of some populism here, I want to come to both of you on this, but Jamel, I think it's the first time Kanye West's name has ever been said on Face the Nation, but he and the president had a back and forth this week, the president praising him and saying that Kanye has performed a great service to the Black community by praising President Trump, and that prompted an online exchange about whether Black people have to be Democrats. This is another artist, Chance the Rapper, out saying this. What do we make of this? And I ask you because the president's talking about it.
I think that the best lens to take to this is to use it as sort of a way to begin to understand political dynamics within the African American community. I think there's this idea that because a large majority, or the overwhelming majority of Black Americans vote for Democrats, this reflects sort of broad liberalism within the African American community. But it's more that for Black Americans, as this has been true basically during every single period of American political history where they could participate fully or even partially, kind of the central judgment Black Americans are making with regards to the party system is which of the two parties is going to hurt us less. And then voting decisions go from there. And so there are a lot of conservative black Americans, or conservatism, I think it's different than white Americans, but they're still conservative. But they don't vote for Republicans in this moment because they don't feel that the Republican Party is looking out for their best interests. 60 years ago, it was the reverse. That's, for me, that's my takeaway, a political science lesson, political history lesson about black political behavior.
Jonah, what do you make of this?
Well, first of all, I resent having to have a strong opinion about Kanye West one way or the other. Similarly with Shania Twain, right? Who said that she would have voted for Trump, but she's Canadian, and why are you talking about this in the first place? I think one of the problems that we have in our politics now is that not only is our sort of lifestyles being politicized, our partisan affiliation is being invested with huge meaning, but our politics is being lifestyleized. The high walls between sort of what is considered sort of the entertainment world, you know, as I think I've said on here before, Donald Trump kind of broke the blood-brain barrier between politics and entertainment. And it seems that everything is now flooding in, and a lot of us just want sort of safe harbors where not everything has to be about either Donald Trump or politics in general. And it doesn't seem that's the way the culture is going.
Talking about it, though, because Trump talks about it, I just noted quickly that, you know, Trump has 50 million Twitter followers on his personal account. He retweeted the Kanye West signed MAGA cap on that account. The president that same day had said he wanted pictures of Mike Pompeo's visit to North Korea put out in the public. But when those came out, it was the official White House account with only 17 million followers that retweeted that. So, I mean, we can see what's on Trump's mind.
It is. And as I said, first time Kanye West has ever been mentioned on Face the Nation.
You're making history.
We'll be right back in a moment. We want to take a closer look at Friday's summit between the leaders of North and South Korea. CBS News correspondent Ben Tracy filed this report from Seoul.
It was just one step, but it made history. Kim Jong-un became the first North Korean leader to cross the border into the South. Then, a diplomatic dance, as Kim invited South Korean President Moon Jae-in to step back across the military demarcation line into North Korea. That was the first of several unexpected moments, as South Korea rolled out the red carpet for its nemesis from the north. The two leaders seemed to form an instant rapport. At one point, Kim Jong-un said he would no longer interrupt President Moon's sleep with early morning missile launches. Of course, those weapons and the North agreeing to get rid of them was the goal of the summit. But there was no talk of how or when or what North Korea would demand in return. Kim Jong-un declared he wants peace and prosperity and an official end to the Korean War. But all that rosiness is competing with reality. President Moon, a former human rights lawyer, is negotiating with a brutal dictator known for some of the worst human rights abuses on the planet. For now, the South Koreans are giving Kim Jong-un the benefit of the doubt, hoping he is a different and more honest North Korean leader. He did show some evidence of that at the summit, even acknowledging that the roads in his country are in such terrible shape, he'd be embarrassed if President Moon had to travel on them.
So that was CBS News correspondent Ben Tracy reporting from South Korea. We're joined now by Ian Bremmer. He is the president of the Eurasia Group and is also the author of a new book, Us versus Them, The Failure of Globalism. Ian, good to have you here. I want to start on the news of the week with North Korea. Moon Jae-in seems to have totally changed the topic. We're not talking about military strikes. Now we're talking about diplomatic breakthroughs.
That's right. And so first of all, big win that the United States and the Trump administration were able to push the North Koreans to this point, both carrots and sticks, right? Offering a summit, not talking about human rights, but also saying, you don't get this right, we're going to squeeze you really hard, maybe military strikes. The Chinese got to the table first, right? That's all plus. But you can't talk about preemption. Military strikes if the Chinese and the South Koreans and the North Koreans are all engaged in summitry and making peace. And that is exactly what's happening right now. So if Trump wants to have a meeting with Kim Jong-un and declare that this is a great breakthrough and it's a historic win and no other president can do it, he can do that. But the idea that Trump's going to be able to force denuclearization right now, he's lost a significant piece of his leverage.
What did you make of National Security Advisor John Bolton, who was on this show and repeatedly mentioned the Libya model as what they want to see happen with North Korea? What does that mean for our audience?
Well, what it means for the North Koreans, they know what the eventual outcome of the Libyan model was, which is Gaddafi gave up the ability to put together nuclear and chemical weapons, and he ended up dead. And if you are Kim Jong-un, the idea of denuclearization, right, is one that is almost inconceivable for any analyst, given Saddam Hussein, given Gaddafi, also given Iran. One of the things that's really interesting to watch on the Iran deal, clearly Bolton, private citizen, wants it dead. Bolton, National Security Advisor, on your show saying, let's see what the president's going to say. But, you know, that's a self-imposed deadline, May 12th. Kim Jong-un is, the meeting is after that. I think there's a lot of pressure on Trump right now. Yes, he can rip it up, but don't rip it up before. Give Macron and Merkel a chance to go back. They said that they can work on something else, something additional, maybe on ballistic missiles and the rest. Let Trump have a chance to blame them for failure, then rip it up, but first get your deal done with the North Koreans.
Buy yourself more time. I want to talk about your book here, Us Versus Them. It's a fascinating read, but you really lay out a pretty damning vision of where the world is headed and the various structural issues that you say we're not talking enough about. That populists aren't the problem, they're the symptom of the problem.
Yeah, I have a hard time saying that Trump is the fault of a more divided country than I've ever experienced, especially because it's not just in the U.S. It's across all of the advanced industrial democracies in the world today, except for Japan, where they have no immigrants and the population is shrinking, right? We have big economic issues where a lot of people feel left behind by globalization, big social and cultural issues where a lot of people feel left behind as we welcome in more immigrants. We have big security issues where enlisted men and women and their families feel left behind because the United States is sending them to wars that fail. They come back, a lot of them broken. Veterans Administration doesn't work, we don't treat them as heroes. And now we have technology that's not only displacing more workers than globalization ever did, but it's also dividing us in terms of what we do and don't watch, who we listen to, who we follow, and who we like. That's structural. That's why Trump won. That's why Bernie Sanders was who he was. That's why Merkel just got destroyed in her last election as the Alternative for Deutschland. That's why the Italians had the worst outcome for the established political parties since World War II. I mean, only Macron has one of the globalists, and he almost didn't make it into the second round because of historic wins by the far left and the far right in France. In America, we think everything's about us. But if we recognize we're not so unique here, this is happening all over the world, we have to stop with it's all about Trump. You can get rid of Trump. You're not going to impeach him probably, but he's going to go after 4 or 8 years. You're not going to fix any of these problems.
It is a really fascinating political analysis, and it's one that I recommend you have a tall drink and not of water with, because it is you highlight a lot of really key issues that we should be talking about. We got to leave it there. Ian, thank you for coming on the show. We'll be right back. That's it for today. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.